They thought they were invincible, but the spineless cowards responsible for the murder of Veronica Guerin had bitten off much more than they could chew. They were just too thick to know it at the time. The Gilligan gang partied as if there was no tomorrow. But as these brash, loud-mouthed thugs celebrated their exploits, the good guys were at last getting their act together. Soon the smiles would be wiped from their smug faces. Soon the smirks would disappear, and panic would set in. In time, they would be spilling the beans on each other and squirming like rats on a sinking ship.
We made our minds up. They were not going to get away with it. They were not going to get away with it. That is why we used the full ammunition of the state, the power of the state, all the specialist units within the force to concentrate on this particular crime.
The newly appointed Garda Commissioner, Pat Byrne, turned to one of the most talented and respected police officers in the country to pursue the killers of Veronica Guerin and bring them to justice. That man was Tony Hickey. Operating from his investigation headquarters at Lucan Garda Station, Hickey launched an unprecedented offensive against organised crime.
The Commissioner appointed me to lead the investigation at the incident room at Lucan. People have talked a lot about the pressure, politically and otherwise, and media pressure. That's always there in serious cases, in the ether kind of style. But any case I've ever been on, the main pressure is self-inflicted, and you want to do a good job and you want to solve the crime because you see the victim and you go to the post-mortem and you meet the families. But there was no particular pressure on us to solve this. We were naturally expected to do a professional job. And at a very early stage, we had intelligence from several sources, more than one source, saying who did it.
While Tony Hickey and his team tried to keep an open mind in the early stages of the investigation, the dogs in the street knew John Gilligan and his mob were the prime suspects. After all, Gilligan was due to face charges for assaulting Veronica, and the fact that he had disappeared from Ireland on the eve of the murder and was now lying low in Holland was seen as a little more than suspect.
I have known of John Gilligan since the late 1970s, where I was working as a detective in Tallyguard Station at the time. He was known as the leader of what was commonly known as the warehouse gang, whose speciality was breaking into warehouses in Dublin and elsewhere throughout the country and stealing large amounts of property. He's also the individual that Veronica Guerin had identified as one of the Mr. Bigs in Ireland and who had amassed huge wealth as a result of his drug trafficking activities. We also have in the photograph Peter Mitchell, an inner city criminal who had the ability to distribute drugs in the inner city, along with Brian Meehan and a number of others. Also in the photograph we have Mr. Fixit, John Traynor. He would have had the ability to introduce John Gilligan to a huge amount of international contacts, people who could be trusted and who would also organise the shipment of drugs. Traynor would have been the individual who had knowledge of the financial institutions and how they worked, and would have been an advisor to John Gilligan on how to launder the huge profits that were generated from the drug trafficking. We also have Brian Meehan, who I would regard as his number two in the organisation. Brian Meehan, along with a number of other runners that they had in the gang, were transporting monies into Holland and changing it in the casinos, Irish punts into guilders. They needed huge cash monies to pay for their drugs that they were importing into Ireland. Paul Ward is here in the photographs as well, as is Patrick Holland, otherwise known as Dutchie. He had been an ex-Marine, had gone to America and joined the Marines. He was a trained killer, in other words. All of these four individuals came together and got to know one another while they were incarcerated in Portage Jail. John Gilligan was serving a 4-year sentence in the early 1990s, where I had sent him myself from the Special Criminal Court after he was convicted of burglary and receiving stolen property.
Brian Meehan, by God, Brian Meehan's playing very well here today. Well done, Brian Meehan.
Brian Meehan was in prison for in his connection with his involvement in an armed robbery of a bank.
Go ahead, take a shot. Up to Paul Ward. Paul Ward out.
Paul Ward was there because of his convictions for armed robbery.
Oh, referee.
And Patrick Holland was there because he was convicted of explosive charges.
We had known Gene Holland since the mid-70s when he was part of a gang that robbed the payroll in the Mater Hospital and subsequently got a long sentence. He was arrested afterwards with a shotgun in Dublin. And in about 1986 or 87, when I was in the Central Detective Unit, I was part of a team that targeted him, and he was involved at that stage in trading gelignite for guns with the Provisional IRA, and he was arrested in Sherrard Street, and he got a sentence which he was serving when he met Gilligan in Portlaoise.
Within 2 years of their collective release from prison, the Gilligan gang had grossed over £25 million from the sale of hash, heroin and cocaine. These corporate profits were placed in double jeopardy by Veronica Guerin's assault case against John Gilligan. In open court, she could tell the whole truth about the mob and their profits and not risk a libel writ. A conviction for Gilligan would almost certainly derail the gravy train. While he denied any role in Veronica's murder, he did boast about his newfound wealth. He bragged that he had over £15 million offshore. That was no exaggeration. In 2 years alone, he spent over £27,000 on Aer Lingus first-class flights to Amsterdam, where he organised his drug trade.
The workload that went into this particular investigation was awesome, and the team under Tony Hickey was immense, and what was uncovered was extraordinary.
We arrested, I think it was over 200 people, and we seized over 100 firearms. It's fair to say that the criminal fraternity, who weren't involved, did regard Veronica's assassination as a step too far, and we got cooperation from very unlikely sources within the criminal underworld, and indeed from some of the subversive groups, in that, for instance, people that we were checking out their movements, they supplied alibis where they normally wouldn't cooperate to any degree. And the investigation gathered a certain amount of momentum from there.
The pressure on the Gardaí turned the underworld upside down. Some gangsters contemplated shooting Gilligan as a result of the losses they were suffering. But George the Penguin Mitchell had another idea: murder a cop. According to one intelligence report, Mitchell advised Gilligan that the best way to take the heat off was to ambush a cop, any cop. The Penguin suggested that a machine gun be used to riddle a police officer. This, he said, would cause so much confusion that the Guerin case would be forgotten.
The intelligence indicated that they were talking about attacking a member of the Garda Síochána, whether it would be feasible or would it deflect the investigation. It was confrontational, it was difficult, it wasn't easy. These were tough, dangerous people.
Hickey and his team were instructed to be extra vigilant and to wear their firearms at all times. 2 members of the Special Detective Unit, armed with Uzi machine guns, were also deployed at night to guard the investigation incident room. The police station itself in Lucan was refurbished to accommodate fire and bomb-proof safes to store evidence. As Gilligan's gang were watching the detectives, they themselves were unaware that another arm of the state was being mobilised against them, the Criminal Assets Bureau.
From day one, we worked very closely with the Criminal Assets Bureau. It was a war on 2 fronts, because prior to that, people who were involved in organised crime and making profits, even if they did go to prison, they could come back out and resume their lifestyle. And there was always what might be called a nest egg there. In this place, there was a pretty big nest egg.
One of the most surprising things was the level of wealth that had been accumulated in a short time by drug trafficking. One of the low-life runners got a free Honda Civic and £3,000 a week just to collect money. The money was gathered every week in a counting house. It took 2 people a day to count the money, and they didn't count the fivers because it took too long. The fivers were kept for local expenditure. And then the money was brought out in bags, ultimately to Holland for the next week's consignment.
There was so much money around that they were finding it hard to handle it, and even counting it provided certain difficulties. They were trying to get rid of money in gambling casinos in Amsterdam and on the racetrack and in bookie shops, and actually had to succeed in losing money so that they could launder the money. The Gilligan bet on all the horses in particular races just to get rid of money and to make it legit, and he collected a vast amount of betting slips. It was quite unsophisticated, but effective as far as it went.
Officers from the Criminal Assets Bureau traced every bet John Gilligan made for over 2 years before the murder of Veronica Guerin. They soon discovered a very strange pattern. Gilligan and his bagmen would typically bet on every horse in every race with bookies all over Dublin. Now, while this may seem an odd way to launder drug money, it certainly proved to be a winner for the diminutive Godfather. In 2 years, John Gilligan, posing as a professional gambler, placed bets totaling over £5 million. In that period, he won back £4.8 million. Cab discovered that his losses over that period were just 11.5% of the total. When calculated on the lowest standard rate of taxation, Gilligan's money laundering operation was providing superb value for money. Everywhere he went, Gilligan carried photocopies of the checks he received from the various bookies. He used these as proof of his very good fortune.
What sticks out in our mind about the Gilligan case is the shock that we all got when we discovered exactly how much money they were making from criminal activity. All of the people involved had property. We talk about blocks of flats, apartments on the Keys, holiday homes in Britis, newish jeeps, racehorses, everything you could think of as the trappings of wealth.
It's amazing the profits that can be made from cannabis trafficking, in that within a matter of a couple of years, John Gilligan, who had lived in a corporation house at this stage in June of '96, he was living in an equestrian centre in Jessbrook.
Gilligan was in possession, without mortgage, of the biggest equestrian centre in Europe. So that called for an explanation, and his earnings record didn't warrant anything like that. We were stunned at the level of money, absolutely stunned.
Now we'd a war being fought on two fronts. Tony Hickey and his inquiry team were squeezing Gilligan and his accomplices from one side. Cab was coming at them from the other. Tony Hickey wanted to put them behind bars, while Cab wanted to trace and take their money away. When the CAB set out to nail John Gilligan, no one knew the extent of his wealth and his possessions. A dedicated team of bureau officers coming from the ranks of the police, revenue, social welfare and customs set about uncovering the true scale of the drug lord's riches. To do that, they had to slog through acres of paperwork and red tape to get the full picture. Jessbrook was the place to start.
In August-September of 1996, the initial team in the Bureau began to investigate what the dogs in the street in Ireland knew who the Bureau should be targeting. That's John Gilligan and his property empire.
Now, this was the original gate here, Felix.
This is the original gate into the Jessbrook.
It's completely overgrown now.
We're totally now 11 years after the event. It is. And over here on the left-hand side, we have the complete equestrian centre that he built. Show-jumping arena with seating accommodation for 300 to 400 people in that large building there. Mm-hmm. The dwelling house is situated down behind the trees where the television aerial is. Up on the right-hand side, he erected stables and living quarters for the staff overhead.
Oh, my God.
Plan was to build it into a recognised equestrian centre with 70 acres attached to it, all the facilities for horses, and entice the people to come here and compete for prizes.
But they had serious ambitions to make this one of the biggest equestrian centres in the country, weren't they?
Well, that was their dream, to make it a, shall we say, state-of-the-art equestrian centre.
While the Bureau were busy adding up the sums in the various bank accounts controlled by John Gilligan, his gang were still busy importing drugs from Europe. Despite the intensive investigation, the gang shipped in 2,000 kilos of hash in the 2 months after the Gilligan murder and earned £2.5 million profit in the process. But they were getting careless. A search in the warehouse they used to distribute the cannabis was to point the cab in the direction of hidden treasures.
This was an area used by John Gilligan and his criminal gang at the time in 1996 for a number of years, where they stored all of their cannabis. They used it as a distribution centre. Following the search of this place in early October of 1996 by the guards, very important evidence was found here to substantiate the fact that this was a major criminal enterprise of drug trafficking. There was a large quantity of cannabis found, some firearms, but more importantly, inside in the garage or in the warehouse was found what we refer to as a checklist. It lists about 15 to 20 people who were involved in the network of distribution of the drugs. It itemised the amounts of money that each owed the warehouse storeman, we will call him, and the amount of drugs that were distributed weekly. That checklist then was able to be used in a lot of cases as intelligence to support the belief of the chief that a certain item or a certain bank account was proceeds of crime. The warehouse was a kind of the last chain in their route from Holland via Cork, the Naas Road, and then transported here by van, principally by the number 2 and number 3s in the gang. That's the Brian Meekins and a number of other runners.
All lines of inquiry led back to Holland. It was here, with the help of John Traynor, that Gilligan had been introduced to the big time. Within 2.5 years, from November 1993 to June 1996, his trade links with European gangsters would generate a multi-million pounds turnover and make them all very wealthy men.
Members of the Gilligan gang would arrive here in Amsterdam with hold-all bags stuffed with cash. Then they convert the Irish currency into Dutch guilders and various bureaux de change around the area. Then the money would be handed over to agents acting on behalf of Gilligan's main supplier here, Simon Rahman. Within a day or so, a new shipment would be on its way via Rotterdam to Cork. During that period of time, the gang exchanged a cool 14.5 million euros.
In Ireland, Gilligan had used betting shops as a devious cover for money laundering. In Holland, he realised that casinos were a good banker for washing his cash. Gilligan and his associates would visit various casinos and buy up £100,000 worth of gambling chips. Then they would spend a few hours gambling small amounts at the tables before cashing in those chips. The gangsters would request that they be paid with a casino cheque. Gilligan could then pass off the cheques as legitimate earnings from gambling.
From the 1980s, Amsterdam has been recognised as a hub, like a supermarket, where criminals come to purchase drugs. You can buy any type of narcotic in this city, and you can buy it at reasonable money, ship it back to Ireland and make a huge profit. We have learned, since the murder of Ronnie Gearan, the enterprise and the business that John Gilligan ran. He ran it all from Holland in respect of obtaining his drugs and shipping them back to Ireland.
Using the smuggling route from here in the port of Rotterdam, John Gilligan and his mob made a cool €32 million profit in just 2 years. And that figure, everyone agrees, is conservative.
By late 1996, the Criminal Assets Bureau had done its homework on John Gilligan. For tactical reasons, it was decided to assess him for tax on his obvious but unexplained income.
The tax laws, long before the Criminal Assets Bureau came along, were and are the most draconian body of legislation within the state in terms of effectiveness. Because the onus shifts immediately onto the suspect to prove where he got the assets or where he got the money, and therefore the suspect has to engage, it's a much more efficient option for the Bureau. John Gilligan had amassed the largest equestrian indoor centre in Europe without mortgage, mostly through cash payments. How could they justify it? Now, on that basis, there was ample evidence to bring a tax case against him.
Now, to get him for tax, a tax inspector had to sign the form, basically saying, you know, this is my assessment that you owe the tax. And of course, the problem, because of what had happened to other public servants, one of whom was left by the general at the side of a railway track in Sandymount with bullets shot through his legs, there was an understandable fear among people who would be putting their name to a document like that, knowing the record that we do and did then of Gilligan.
In the past, revenue officials literally risked their lives when they served tax demands on gangsters. So who would serve the demand on John Gilligan?
Now, we examined the legislation and we found that there is no requirement of any skill or function or any connection with the Revenue Commissioners to be a tax inspector. So we proposed to Rory Quinn that someone within the Bureau would be made a tax inspector.
And then Barry, with the twinkle in his eye, said, well, of course, if you make me a tax inspector, on top of all the other things, then I can sign it. And I'm out there anyway. And he was fearless. And I looked at somebody from my own office and wondered, like, is that possible? Is there a limit to the number of tax inspectors, etc.? And we very quickly established that it was capable of being done. I, as Minister for Finance, with the cooperation of the Revenue Commissioners, made him a tax inspector, and that meant that in that instance and in subsequent areas where the signature of a tax inspector was needed, that could be done within the framework of the protection of the Criminal Assets Bureau.
It's a bit like the turkeys voting for Christmas. And I was made a tax inspector, duly appointed and sworn in, and then I signed the assessments.
John Gilligan was in hiding in Holland, but he was not beyond the reach of the Bureau. Neither was his wife Geraldine, who was regarded as a central figure in her husband's conspiracy. Assessing all available intelligence, Barry Galvin had reached the conclusion that Geraldine had been a full partner in her husband's criminal enterprises. And when the cab's revenue officers totted up their calculations, they reckoned that John Gilligan owed the state £1.75 million for the year 1995 alone. They assessed Geraldine for over £1 million for the same year.
On the morning of September the 17th, 1996, two officers from the Criminal Assets Bureau arrived here to serve the tax assessment on Geraldine Gilligan. In an ironic twist, it was almost exactly a year to the day that Veronica Guerin also called to these gates and was attacked as a result by John Gilligan.
In the autumn of 1996, it all began to unravel for Gilligan. In November, Cab came calling again, this time with a final demand for £3.5 million in tax for himself and Geraldine. For the first time ever, the Irish public were discovering the true scale of the monetary value of organised crime. John Gilligan was none too pleased that his dirty big secret was finally out in the open.
The tax demand infuriated Gilligan, who couldn't believe the absolute cheek of the authorities. The following day, he rang an associate to tell him how he felt about all of this. The police secretly recorded that conversation, and this is what he said. Who in the fuck do these pricks think they are? Are they fucking mad? It's fucking daylight robbery, that's what it is.
The clock was ticking against the Gilligans as and from the day their assessments were served. After a lapse of in excess of 30 days, the sheriff was contacted, and a force of Gardaí, including myself, visited Jessbrook and seized a large amount of property to satisfy the tax assessment that had been served on John Gilligan. And in that seizure, we also seized a large number of horses and any livestock that was there.
So there were demands for what? Something like £2.5 million, wasn't it?
Mine was 882,000, but the one that I got on the 14th of this month was gone up with interest to 1,292,000.
Subsequently, Geraldine Gilligan appealed all of this and was ruled in the Supreme Court months later that she was not a chargeable person and was therefore deemed that the search that we had conducted and the seizure that we had conducted on the tax assessment was unlawful, and the properties that we had seized were returned to her.
Geraldine had won a skirmish and got some of John's loot back on the basis that a wife's income was deemed to be her husband's and not her own. But John still had a case to answer and a mounting tax bill to pay.
So the questions have been raised, of course, where all this money came from. How do you answer that?
We can prove all that. We can prove all that.
You prove where it came from?
Yes.
Is this through money made on gambling and things?
We can prove all that, and it will be proved.
Neither Geraldine Gilligan or her husband John have ever proved where it all came from.
The law just did not authorise at the time for the Bureau or for the tax inspector to issue an assessment on Geraldine Gilligan. It was purely authorised to issue an assessment on John Gilligan. The revenue laws have been subsequently changed and amended, and currently both spouses can be assessed for income tax.
As the cab continued to flex its muscle against the leading figures in Irish organised crime, in a chilling twist, the Godfathers began to target the leadership of the Bureau.
The perception was they were not going to take it lying down. And to a certain extent, they tried not to take it lying down. There was widespread attempted intimidation of people who might cooperate with the Bureau. There was intelligence of attempts to have somebody shot.
This is how gangsters deal with threats.
The man in the crosshairs was Barry Galvin.
John Morrissey was an international crime boss, originally from England, commonly known as a hitman within the underworld. He owned a restaurant here in Kinsale, had spent a large amount of money on the renovation of same, had many connections in the underworld in Ireland. John Morrissey was identified by the major players in Dublin as an individual who could carry out some action of threats or fear against the Bureau. Reliable information was received at the Bureau and in Garda Síochána that this John Morrissey had identified Barry Galvin as a person who should be targeted. It was learned that the underworld had amassed a profile of Mr. Galvin and his family. Their plan was to cause intimidation and an air of fear within the Bureau by taking some dreadful action against Barry and his family.
So what kind of action were they prepared to take? What were they planning?
John Morrissey was regarded as a hitman, a person who commits murder at a price. This was a serious threat. We were not playing with Division 4 players here. This man was a Premier League criminal.
Barry Galvin was a very courageous guy. He was a tough cookie. I had him do a Garda course for driving Garda cars, and also in terms of his protection, because he was a person who would have been very, very vulnerable at the time. I had him do a firearms course the same as any other detective one, and I said if he qualified, he was issued a firearms, and he was.
The Garda Commissioner directed that Mr. Galvin be armed at all times. He was issued with a personal sidearm. Also, each and every guard officer that was attached to the Bureau was armed.
Contrary to public belief, I didn't arm myself with a machine gun and go out in operations to that sense. I occasionally went out with the people to see property or to see people, but my operational side was assembling the evidence and bringing it to the court.
While Barry Galvin was armed and protected at all times, his most potent weapon turned out to be his firepower as Cab's legal supremo. Ironically, one of the investigations overseen by him was into his would-be assassin, one John Morrissey.
Cab came to Kinsale, conducted a major investigation, carried out a large number of searches on John Morrissey, his residence, his restaurant and his business. He had a boat in the harbour. He had a large amount of jewellery. This was all seized by the Bureau. Morrissey, like all major crime bosses, decided the best way for him was to get out of Ireland. He left this jurisdiction and is now known he's living in the south of Spain and continues to carry on his criminal activities of organising drug shipments, working with Irish international drug traffickers.
As the Cab's investigation into John Gilligan's wealth continued, Tony Hickey's team scored a major breakthrough. 3 leading members of the Gilligan gang, Russell Warren, John Dunn and Charlie Bowden, were arrested. They cracked under interrogation and agreed to squeal on their accomplices. The Supergrasses and their families were put under round-the-clock Garda protection.
Now, these were people involved deeply in the workings of the gang. Bowden was in charge of drug trafficking, together with the others, with Mitchell, Meehan and Ward and various other characters. Russell Warren was the bagman for the Gilligan gang, exporting money and moving money around the place. If you're going after a major player, you can, in fishing parlance, you can use a sprat to catch a salmon. You can't do it the other way around.
Because of the action of law enforcement, and in this case, the investigation team, his whole gang was completely disrupted. They were completely at sea in respect of what was happening in Ireland. Firearms, guns, people were being arrested and charged with very serious offences, which actually created a huge amount of confusion within the whole group.
After Bowden, Warren and Dunn were turned, the writing was on the wall for the rest of the gang. Some were now in jail on remand, some were on the run. Gilligan himself was lying low in Holland, but decided to break cover in order to keep the business afloat. He travelled to Heathrow to collect a suitcase stuffed with drug money. It was to prove a rash move.
It got to the stage where so much of his gang had been targeted that he himself had to do the dirty thing and do his own work and carry the case of money.
All the crime boss has got to do is make one mistake and get his hands dirty, the guards have to be lucky in respect of catching them at that particular time.
Gilligan was going through Heathrow Airport with, I think it was in the region of 300,000 in cash. But it's only human nature that if you had that amount of money, you would be likely to bring it yourself. Gilligan was arrested at Heathrow, and shortly after that, Felix McKenna from the Criminal Assets Bureau and one of our people from the incident room in Lucan went over to interview him.
I had opportunity of seeing Mr. Gilligan in the custody suites of Heathrow Airport. I had crossed swords with him and crossed his path many, many times. He was polite enough, I have to say, and I told him that I would see him in about 14 years if he was lucky. The following day, or maybe 2 days later, John Gilligan was charged with money laundering the proceeds of the suitcase, which was in excess of 300,000 Irish pounds. The immediate impact of that arrest was that it created a huge boost of confidence for the Lucan investigation team. This was their main suspect now behind bars in England.
Gilligan was remanded in custody here to Belmarsh Maximum Security Prison in East London, where he was classified as a Category A prisoner. This classification is only given to the most dangerous terrorists and criminals. For the next 3.5 years, John Gilligan used every legal device open to him to fight his extradition and win his freedom.
As he languished in Belmarsh prison, John Gilligan got news of other setbacks. Paul Ward, a central member of his gang, was arrested in early October 1996. Then in April 1997, Patrick Duchy Holland, Gilligan's enforcer and the man suspected by Gardaí of pulling the trigger on Veronica Guerin, was captured as he tried to sneak back into the country on a Holyhead ferry wearing a disguise. Then in October of the same year, Gilligan's most trusted lieutenant, Brian Meehan, also ran out of road.
On the run and low on funds, Brian Meehan and John Traynor were arrested by police shortly after they left Central Station here in Amsterdam. Meehan was subsequently flown home to Ireland to stand trial for Veronica Guerin's murder.
The stage was now set for a murder trial and that long-delayed encounter with the Criminal Assets Bureau. After 3 years fighting his extradition, John Gilligan was finally frog-marched home. Clad like a joker, the camera-shy crime boss had also begun a series of legal challenges contesting the constitutionality of the powers of the Criminal Assets Bureau. His legal team argued that to impoverish a person on the belief, without charge or conviction, of a chief superintendent or a revenue officer was the slippery slope to the creation of a police state.
The accusation that CAB is the start of a slippery slope to a police state or a constitutionally impermissible combination of powers, all of that, I have to say, is nonsense. One of the critical sections in the Proceeds of Crime Act is the low standard of proof. People who are money laundering or concealing their property or having it in false names or who get it by robbing banks or drug trafficking, they're not necessarily people who leave an easy money trail after them. If the Chief Bureau Officer swears to the court that in his opinion certain property is the proceeds of crime, and if he can demonstrate to the court that he has reasonable grounds for that belief, then the onus shifts onto the defendant to show where he got the property. No more, no less.
The legislation that was provided and the setting up of the Criminal Assets Bureau was necessary for society to protect itself. And society has a right to protect itself through legislation and through its members in the Oireachtas. The Oireachtas saw that and rightly so implemented necessary legislation.
I remember being in a television studio with the journalist Vincent Brown, where he said that it was legal illiteracy. Legal illiteracy. We ensured that the legislation was constitutional by A, giving the individual a right to prove that he really got the assets legally, and B, by providing for compensation if a mistake was made.
The absolute proof that the Act is not bringing any injustice is to look at how many of the people who have been targeted who've attempted to show a legitimate source. I won in the lotto. I got it from my Auntie Maisie in America, who died leaving a fortune. None of that. There's only a handful of cases where the defendants have come into court and have attempted to set up a legitimate source for the money.
Gilligan failed to convince Cab that his ranch at Jesbrook was a result of his acumen as a professional gambler. So in a mischievous bid to keep his riches, he backed a long shot and took his case to the High Court.
But Gilligan and the other godfathers got their answer when Judge Catherine McGuinness ruled. Drug crime is perceived as more threatening to communities than paramilitary subversion and terror.
In her 80-page ruling, Mrs. Justice Catherine McGuinness ruled that Cab's far-reaching powers were a proportionate response to the threat posed to society by major criminals like John Gilligan. She said that during the hearing, Garda officers had painted a picture of an entirely new type of professional criminal who organised rather than committed crime and thereby rendered himself virtually immune to the ordinary procedures of criminal investigation and prosecution. She went on to state, such persons are able to operate a reign of terror so as effectively to prevent the passing on of information to the Gardaí. At the same time, their obvious wealth and power cause them to be respected by lesser criminals or would-be criminals.
They tried their damnedest to prove that the legislation was unconstitutional, but the courts of this country said, no, you're all wrong. The legislation is constitutional. It was not legal illiteracy. The legislation was the most literate and articulate piece of legislation, possibly since the foundation of the state.
This was not the only legal setback for the killers of Veronica. The testimony of the Supergrasses sent down most of the gang. Brian Meehan was convicted of the murder of Veronica Guerin and got life in prison. He had carried the assassin on the back of his motorbike on the day of the killing. Dutchie Holland, the suspected triggerman, was jailed for drug trafficking. Paul Ward, Meehan's pal who provided a safe house on the day of the murder, was also jailed. John Gilligan also beat the murder charge, but was found guilty of drug offences and got over 20 years in prison. They were all sent back to where it began, Portlaoise. Tony Hickey's team had got a result. Now it was the turn of the Bureau to make crime pay.
What did the Criminal Assets Bureau do to the Gilligan gang?
Patrick Holland, the Bureau identified that he owned a dwelling house in British County Wicklow. Applications were made to the High Court, the property was frozen, and subsequently orders were granted to sell the same at public auction. This was done, and the property realised at the time £350,000. In respect of Paul Ward, the Bureau identified his dwelling house, which had been used immediately after the murder of Veronica Guerin. That property was sold to satisfy a revenue debt. Also in Paul Ward's case, the Bureau identified tracker bonds that he had concealed a large amount of monies that he had generated from drug trafficking. They were seized under the Proceeds of Crime Act. Brian Meehan, the Bureau identified in 1996 properties in Dublin. That is an apartment on the Quays, and he also owned a dwelling house in the Fairview area, which was set in about 9 apartments.
He had an apartment on the Quays near the Law Society, and he also had a block of flats out near Summerhill. Now, the apartment was easy enough because it was vacant, but the Summerhill property was fully tenanted. As receiver, I had an obligation to have the rents collected, and in fact, one of the Gilligan associates tried to collect the rent and was threatening the tenants, but he was quickly put off. And for a period, we collected the rent from the tenants, and who seemed to prefer the cab to the original owner. And then eventually the property was sold by public auction.
In Brian Meehan's case, subsequently the Bureau identified, following the money trail and following the assistance that we got from the banks, a large bank account in Vienna. This bank account was frozen by the High Court in Dublin and subsequently frozen by the Austrian courts. The amount of money was at the time in excess of 700,000 sterling. In respect of Peter Mitchell, the Bureau's investigation identified 2 properties. They were frozen under the Proceeds of Crime Act and later sold at public auction. Something that Peter Mitchell and his co-conspirators did at the time, they destroyed their properties prior to vacating sin, removing the sinks, kitchens, bathrooms, all the fittings that they had in the houses were all removed by the mysterious white van the evenings before we got the court orders. In respect to John Trainor's assets, he was dealt with by the Bureau using its tax arms. The Bureau sold a property in Waterford, a property that was set in apartments. I think there was about 15 apartments in it, which he was collecting rents from for many years. The Bureau took over his dwelling house in Waterford and sold it to pay his tax debt. Come to the principal player, that's John Gilligan himself. In 1996, all of his known assets were frozen by the High Court. To date, as we speak, 2007, 2008, John Gilligan is still contesting the Proceeds of Crime Act in the courts. And the property has remained frozen for all of that length of time. Along with that, any other monies that could be identified over the last 10, 12 years as being connected indirectly or directly back to John Gilligan have been seized by the Criminal Assets Bureau and used to pay off his tax debt.
All told, the Criminal Assets Bureau hit the Gilligan organisation for up to €10 million and counting. But some assets remain beyond their reach. Gilligan still has a large nest egg in Spain, including a bar called the Judge's Chambers and other properties, which are nice little earners for his retirement if Cab don't get there first. At home, he is still fighting Cab's bid to take Jesbrook from him. Meanwhile, his wife Geraldine continues to look after his interests in Alicante and continues to defend her good name.
That is bollocks. I'm not the godmother of crime. I've never been anywhere near crime.
Over 11 years ago, John Gilligan made a big mistake when he started handling his own drug money and he was caught in Heathrow Airport with £330,000 in cash. We're here now at Uxbridge Magistrates Court in North London, where, believe it or not, 11 years later, John Gilligan is trying his best to get that money back, which would illustrate just how greedy the man is. He's in there, live via video link from his prison cell in Portlaoise Prison back in Ireland, telling the magistrates to tissue lies about why he should get his money back. And he's also sent his former bagman, Derek Baker, here to testify on his behalf. Hello, Derek, how are you doing? I've been trying to meet you for a long time. How's it going? What are you doing trying to get back John Gilligan's drug money now after all this 11 years?
I'm not trying to get it back. I'm under fucking pressure. I say no to go and do the fucking thing. Do you think I wanted to come over here?
Well, how come you never talked to me before about this when we were trying to talk to you?
Because you put stuff in the paper about me that I was just, I'm an ordinary Joe. I was only trying to get back my life. And it's made...
But how did you get mixed up with Gilligan?
If you want to come somewhere, I'll talk to you.
No, hang on. Someone's talk to you here.
I'm going to photographer that.
No, that's fine. But you have to get your picture, Derek. You're a very famous man. Derek, look, well, if you want to talk
Derek
here,
Baker was too scared to tell the truth in court. He'd once earned over £1,000 a day placing bets for Gilligan. Baker himself had to settle with Cab when he failed to pay tax on all that money he'd earned as a runner. In Uxbridge last summer, Gilligan gazed down at him on the video screen in court. Derek told the magistrate that he knew Gilligan to be a gambler, a punter who backed on every horse and never seemed to lose. He mentioned nothing about John Gilligan's involvement in organised crime.
Anyway, what did you tell the judge in there now today? Come here, tell me, Derek, did you tell him lies?
No, what did you tell him?
John Gilligan is still running his drug trade from in here, on the comfort of his prison cell with a mobile telephone. But Ewing is still a long way from the Costa Blanca.
I would like to think that the Criminal Assets Bureau reinforced and brought back into its proper place the confidence of the public in the criminal justice system. I think Ireland is unique in over that period. I think it's over 2 or 3 years that the incidence of serious crime went down by 1/3 in Ireland.
Men who thought that they could do what they wanted, that they could stash away as much as they needed to, found that it wasn't so after all. I think it was a bit like waking up in the morning after drinking a bottle of whiskey, believing that the party could continue and there would be no hangover. There was.
And in relation to Veronica Guerin, I'm sure it's cold comfort for her family, her mother Bernie, Cahill and Graham and the extended family, of whom I have become a kind of associate member since June of '96. They're the people ultimately who have suffered, but the Criminal Assets Bureau is a monument and a legacy to her memory, and has become a model not alone for law enforcement in Europe, but throughout the wider law enforcement community.